are doing tremendous work. Uh-oh. So, looks like I got hit with that recording button. Just give me 1 second here.
Sorry about that, Jermaine. I thought I hit it
that's
earlier.
Okay. That's okay. I just had to kind of exit that out of my screen there. But yeah, I looked into you all's organization and just got to know you all a little bit. And I think you all are doing tremendous work to house and to feed and to clothe and provide resources for some of the most vulnerable in our society. And I think that it takes a very special kind of compassion to do the work you do. So I salute you. And I want to give a special shout out to Rhett Burden, who took all the burden out of getting me set up here today. And we had some wonderful dialogue about your work, and he's been a fantastic host. And I really want to get started and say that I might say some things today that might unsettle you. I might say something that unseats you. I might say something that unhouses you, but I am here to tell the truth about Native American history. And I go back to the words of Maya Angelou, who said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So I'm going to begin this on a lighter note of humanity because I tell human stories. So the ethos and the spirit behind everything that I do boils down to this quote behind me on my wall back here. And it's from a Roman man named Terence. And he was an enslaved person who was granted freedom and became a playwright around 160 BCE. And he said, I am human, and therefore nothing human is alien to me. So for me, that means that a smile has no religion, a teardrop has no nation, and things like music and food and art and love and ideas can connect us. So the work that I do, and I always ask the question, can we look across history and culture to find the universal bonds that connect us all? And I know that's very hard to do because when we look at history, especially Native American history, what do we see? We see scars, we see wounds, we see injustice, we see disease and slavery and genocide, forced removal. We see dispossession of land, we see forced assimilation, we see poverty, and we see pain. Unchecked capitalism and settler colonialism, all tied to white supremacist thought that has been so shot through indigenous history that it caused the Dakota leader Sitting Bull to say, as he looked out over the landscape and saw the land being grabbed by the US government and settlers, he said, possession is a disease in them. These people make many rules that the rich may break, but the poor may not. And then he goes on to say they have a religion which the poor worship, but the rich will not. And they even take tithes from the poor and weak to support the rich and those who rule. He went on to say that they claim this mother of ours, the earth, for their own use and fence their neighbor away. If America had been twice the size that it is, it still would not have been enough. So I think about what did the 19th century Lakota leader understand as he analyzed the American empire. And this is a man who clung to his traditional ways. He was not quick to assimilate. He fought against American incursion and fighting against the US government. He was ultimately killed by the US government, but he knew that we must stay morally consistent in our critique of US racism, of militarism, of poverty, of materialism. And when we talk about the making of America, some people say that slavery was the nation's original sin, but first America was born as an empire on indigenous people's backs, on indigenous people's lands, all predicated on a white supremacist doctrine that said Native people were inferior. So we could see a lot of the beginnings of race in this story. And we have to be honest here too, because America still wiggles and squirms with discomfort when we talk about race. We are especially polarized when it comes to American history. And that is because the stories we tell about ourselves are powerful, right? History is powerful. We feel it deeply. So people want to own the narrative. They want to be the sole arbitrators of how history is taught. And the American way has been denial of wrongdoing. It has been ignoring what is uncomfortable and whitewashing and banning books. But you cannot teach American history without teaching the whole history of indigenous people. And I think it's very un-American to even have conversations like this about the raw realities of our national history, because it is typically taught as a set of myths and fairy tales. And many people survey the public education system and they wonder, why don't we start American history with Native history? And because we don't, it is largely unknown in America and deeply misunderstood. Indigenous humanity is denied, and it is implied that they contributed nothing of value save an Indian maiden story like Pocahontas or Sacagawea. Or you have these vicious stereotypes like how they talked about the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who America molded into the quote unquote noble savage. This was the language that was used. Or you have the stereotype of the friendly Indian like Squanto, who is presented as though his whole purpose in life was to help white people plant corn and teach them how to survive on the edge of the wilderness. These are the stereotypes that have been perpetuated throughout Native American history. And then you see the commercialization of this history as well, where these stereotypes go into art and entertainment and commercial enterprise. And so you see things like tomahawks and knives used to stereotype Native people as brutal and violent. You see the culture being denigrated by those Atlanta Braves and those Washington Redskins, which in 2020, during the racial protests, a lot of people changed their names, but that still exists. You see kids growing up playing cowboy and Indians, where the Native people are always the villain. And for hundreds of years, companies have been enriched by using images of American Indians to advertise and market American merchandise on everything from cigarettes to butter. All while American Indians were robbed of the bounty of their land. So there are stories that made America, but then you have the myths and stories that America made up. So I salute you all, because in 2021, California became the first state to mandate an ethnic studies course in high school as a graduation requirement. First that we know of, right? So 2021, this is the history that we're talking about, right? The history that so many people want to deny. So I think you all are coming to understand how important it is to tell the stories of the historically unheard. Now, as I get deeper into this, I obviously can't cover all of Native American history in one speech, but I want to highlight just a few things that I think are important. And so I don't know about you, but whenever I was in school, we didn't learn a lot of Native American history. And what we did learn ended around the year 1890. It just disappeared, right? And so there were kids, and there still are kids to this day, who think that quote unquote authentic Native Americans went extinct. If you look at one of the top Google searches about Native people, one of the top Google searches is, do indigenous tribes still exist? So you see this wide gap between ignorance and knowledge of Native history and Native existence even. And then you have this, again, this image of Native people as though they're all supposed to be leathered and feathered and even living in teepees or whatever, but people don't connect to the 574 federally recognized Indian tribes in the country at present. And then there's a lot of other nations that are still even fighting for recognition. So there's more than that. But I want to just highlight the fact that a lot of the Native American movements are modern, right? You know, they're not just this image that we portray them to be. You know, people were driving cars or in jeans and sneakers. It's not these images that we see of dream catchers and deerskins. And I want you, if you have your phone right now, you can do a Google search, image search of Native American, to search the phrase Native American and do an image search. And what you're gonna still see to this day are a lot of black and white photos from the 1800s of Native people with war bonnets on as the dominant image. And then you search any other group, you search Black American, you search white American, you're gonna find contemporary images of people from today. What does that tell us? Well, a lot of that is because a white man is the one who presented the image that we see of Native people, a man named Edward Curtis. He was born in 1868. And this is a man who took 40,000 photos of Native people over his 30-year career, but he did not have their best interests at heart. And a lot of the images that you see in this Google search are going to be from him. But he was funded by the endless wealth of J.P. Morgan, of course, J.P. Morgan Chase. And their goal was to photograph the quote unquote vanishing race. So Curtis was known for misappropriating culture and misrepresenting indigenous nations by giving his subjects clothing and objects, a lot of times that belonged to nations that weren't even there. So he would grab clothing and objects from an indigenous nation 2 states away, so he can create the image he wanted and not the image that was reality. And he would even place his subjects and make them stand away from modern infrastructure so that he could capture them as primitive. And so then there's pastness in the present because those images still fuel stereotypes today. And so I think about the Native American kid, right, who doesn't live up to these stereotypes and, you know, is just trying to make it in the world. What does that do to them? And so I want to talk a little bit about the arrival of Christopher Columbus on an island of the West Indies, which really sparked the enrichment of what will become the United States. And this is where the story of US history typically begins. But there is this myth, though, of this pristine North America as this grassy expanse teeming with game, only sparsely populated. And the story has been told for centuries as though, you know, the land was ripe for the taking for Europeans, and that has never been true. And I want you to continue to rethink and reframe and revise your understanding of pre-Columbian America. I think about the hundreds of indigenous groups with their unique languages and art and social structure and spirituality and culture before 1492. The Americas were very well populated with as many as 112 million people, and that was more than Europe at the time. Many of us know about the Aztec and the Mayan and the Incan empires in South America with aqueducts and hieroglyphic writing and other advances that constitute what would be quote unquote civilized. But we don't talk a lot about North America. We also find cities here. And we also find people who shaped their environment here. We don't talk about the Mississippian cultures enough with their vast trading networks and mound cities. There's a place called Cahokia located near modern East St. Louis, and that may have reached a population of 20,000. And we don't talk about just the societal breakdown of indigenous culture, right? A lot of Native societies, they value freedom. And I think that's a big contradiction today, not so much as the freedom, but the freedom from work, right? The freedom for work in pursuit of wealth and material gain. So I want you to imagine a world where poverty really isn't a concept because no one wants to see a community member in such misery. Those types of communities did exist in a lot of indigenous cultures. And I don't want to sit here and say that it was utopia either, because violence and war and brutality found their way in Native American societies as well. Native people were still human, shot through with the propensity for war and peace and edification and destruction. But I do want to make a very clear distinction here, because we can study the history of war or brutality as a universal human trait and see what that all looks like. But in this story, we have to add the element of racism and understand that Native people did not have a policy of extermination. Many white Europeans in places of power wrote down as an edict from the outset that they wanted to wipe indigenous people off the map and subjugate them all. And that's because they saw them as less than human. So you see, then in America, this years and decades and centuries long, slow but steady colonial production and construction of industrial power and economic power that innovated some of the most savage weaponry ever. You see this lust for resources and cheap labor and the infusion of white supremacy, creating this unparalleled war machine that was really unprecedented in human history. And so now that we've laid some foundation, we get to this crossroads at 1492. When I was in school, we had to sing the song in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? That's what we learned. And we have to remember when it comes to this history, first and foremost, the first encounter indigenous people had with Europeans was not with Europeans, but European diseases. You had smallpox and measles and chickenpox and influenza and typhus and typhoid and malaria and all these horrendous diseases, right? It's kind of like an immunological atomic bomb got dropped on North America as these diseases spread through the air. And this was before European colonizers even stepped on the soil. Some estimates say as many as 70 to 80 to 90% of the indigenous population or certain indigenous populations were killed by disease. But this is where I want to talk about the word genocide, because the destructive power of disease is often used to downplay systemic violence, right? People will say, well, hey, a lot of Native Americans died off from disease, so that they'll use that to kind of downplay the systemic violence. But again, your state, California, your governor was the first official in the nation to apologize and even call the treatment of Native Americans in his genocide. And it's still debatable, and among academic historians whether to use that word or not. But we take genocide, what I take genocide to mean is the definition. It means the various policies and actions, including but not limited to mass violence. And this is aimed at destroying the foundations of life of an ethnic group. So we have all these forms of violence, right? And I'm not going to get too much into graphic detail here. And you can read about this, the Spanish testing the sharpness of their blades on Native peoples, beheading them in contests. There's so many graphic depictions that you can read about. But I think that there's this quote that I always go to, and it's by a philosopher. His name is Theodore Adorno, and he said, "A condition of all truth is to allow suffering to speak." So we should be more concerned about how the suffering felt for the sufferer rather than how the suffering in this depiction makes us feel. So one of the most overlooked parts of Native American history and American history that I want to touch on is the enslavement of indigenous people. Historians tell us that between 1492 and 1880, between 2 and 5.5 million Native Americans were enslaved in America, in addition to 12.5 million African slaves. And since they knew the land, it was much easier for captive Native Americans to escape than those coming over from Africa, but that didn't stop them from being enslaved. What happened was enslaved Native Americans were usually sent to Barbados, they were sent to Bermuda, they were sent to Jamaica, they were sent to Spain and North Africa. So you had this constant alternating exchange of Africans prepped for sale from the islands coming to America. And then you had indigenous people going to the islands in Africa from America. A lot of connections between Black and Native American history. And remember, there are always stories of resistance. And one of the first stories of resistance that comes down to us is from a coalition of Africans and Native people. And it was led by a man named Hatui, a chief who resisted the Spanish in modern day Cuba using guerrilla tactics. He would attack and then retreat to the mountains, attack again, retreat to the mountains. And he did this so much that he kept the Spanish afraid and pinned down for around 3 months until he was caught. And he had a terrible end. But before he was burned alive by the Spaniards on this island, they called it Haiti, modern Haiti. And he was asked, though, if he would accept Christianity to go to heaven. And Hatui asked the priest, he said, well, do Spaniards go to heaven? To which the priest responded that they do, and Hatui declined, saying that he would rather go to hell where he would not see such cruel people. And this story for me just places the juxtaposition between religious freedom and people violently imposing religious beliefs, because of course we know when the Europeans contacted natives and they didn't convert to a European God, it was used to justify the massacre. And I always have to say that we have to keep the deep legacy and the vicious legacy of white supremacy at the center, because Native people were viewed as an inferior race, an inferior order of being that were looked at as poor and wandering clans, unskilled in the art of agriculture and building, and they were looked at as no better than beasts. And they were literally seen as obstacles in the way of a God-ordained Anglo-Saxon progress. And then we get to the story of 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia. The story, I've done a podcast on the story of Pocahontas because it's one of those foundational American stories, right? And she's mentioned, but mostly kids learn about pilgrims, and they even learn about the hardships of the pilgrims and their hopes and everything else. But historians estimate that there were around 50,000 Algonquian people who were living in that area that was the Commonwealth of Virginia when Europeans arrived. And there's this myth of Jamestown, right, as America's first true settlement, where intrepid English explorers established themselves on the American landscape. That's the story. But Pocahontas's people, the Powhatan, again, they were already living there, and they called the land Sinnakamaka. That was their word for home. And while you had native people being called beasts and savages on, literally on paper, being spoken about in that way, Europeans fancied themselves as civilized, but English settlers were starving and dying off as they tried to settle in Virginia, and they turned to cannibalism. So I don't want to be morbid, but I just think that that is something that we have to compare and contrast, right? Because you had people like Thomas Jefferson who were saying the words like merciless Indian savages, right? But you don't hear about the cannibalism in the foundational American myth of this great settlement story, this great discovery story, right? This great enlightenment that came over from Europe whenever they were doing things like that. So I think that we have to get away from, this, you get the Disney version of the Pocahontas story where you have this native girl who has a raccoon for a friend, and you don't hear about the tragic history, right? And this is where we can talk about the forced assimilation. So when we trade the myth for the reality, then we see that Pocahontas wasn't even the name that her people called her. They called her Matawaka. And according to the oral history that isn't touched on enough, that came down from her nation, the Mattapony tribe was part of the Powhatan nation. They have oral history that I've looked to several times. Pocahontas, she was already married whenever Europeans arrived and kidnapped her. She was forced to give up her child. She was wrenched away from her family, her religion, her political system, her core beliefs, her culture, giving up all the things that made her distinctively her. And then she was baptized and renamed Lady Rebecca, then married to John Rolfe. And this process of forced assimilation happened to thousands, tens of thousands, even more Native Americans in a process called Anglicization. And then Pocahontas died. She was 20 or 21 years old after she was taken to Europe, maybe from disease. Some speculate in the oral history that she was killed and her body was never recovered. So we can go all the way back to the 1600s and see the roots of the modern missing and murdered Indigenous women movement in the story of Matawaka. Now we come to a chapter in our story where we explore what is called encroachment. So you had this relentless growth of European forts and the clearing of land as more and more immigrants flooded over from Britain. And one historian that I quote, he said, paraphrasing, everywhere Europeans settled, there was encroachment on tribal lands. And remember that much of tribal culture was intimately linked to the land. So every movement of tribal people from ancestral lands whittled away at the integrity of tribal society with its deep religious dimension. Encroachment, the taking of tribal land. Ottawa Chief Pontiac said they came with the Bible and the religion stole the land, crushed our spirit, and now tell us we should be thankful to the Lord for being saved. And this is where we can begin to understand another current movement, which is land back in our own time. Because when we look at this modern social movement for land reparations, it's rooted in this deep history. And we see, if you study this movement, that people aren't trying to get you to move out of your family home or vacate your property. They're saying that they want to negotiate the return of some public lands and that they want a seat at the table when it comes to making decisions about those lands. And those decisions should include some access to the territories and resources more equitably. And then they're also asking to help manage the national forests and parks to regain their relationship with the land, its bounty, and the Earth's spirit. Makes me think of another indigenous leader. His name was Big Thunder Wabanaki, and he said, the Great Spirit is in all things. He is in the air we breathe. The Great Spirit is the Father, but the earth is our mother. She nourishes us. That which we put into the ground, she returns to us. So I now want to shift to a story of Native power in American history, because Native influence shows up in so many different places, right? And Native power shows up in the very founding of American democracy. The Haudenosaunee, better known as the Iroquois Confederacy, which was a league of independent nations that came together and united themselves for a common cause, as they created what might be considered one of the first constitutions with checks and balances and branches of government to pass laws. Founding fathers like Benjamin Franklin admitted that the United States Constitution was inspired by the Iroquois. Only in the Iroquois version of democracy women had a say, but the US government has since now acknowledged in recent years the large influence that the Iroquois had on the US Constitution. Even they said that the original confederation of the 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy, as were many of the democratic principles which were incorporated into the Constitution itself. So then we see the ways in which Native American history is American history in this way, right? Barbecue even was started by indigenous people. I love barbecue, and just finding out that history. So you have all these influences, right? From the food culture to the Constitution itself. And so we also have to think about the Native American story as a story of adaptability, right? A lot of people have heard about how in 1821, Sequoyah developed a whole writing system for the Cherokee language with 86 symbols. And this is amazing to think about, but most Cherokee people became literate in their native tongue within a few years. It was a brilliant feat of linguistics that happened there. I don't think it's talked about enough, but as time goes on, we kind of get more to the tragic side of history, right? Again, where the policy of assimilation turns into one of mass deportation. This is the era of the Trail of Tears from 1831 to 1850. And I'm going to tell you a quick story about the Choctaw Nation here. The Choctaw, they fought along with General Term President Andrew Jackson against the United Kingdom during the War of 1812. And so for their service, US officials, they ensured that they would be able to keep their territory in perpetuity. But US officials didn't keep that promise, and the Choctaw were forced from their ancestral homelands to the West anyway. As a matter of fact, they were the first nation to be removed under Andrew Jackson's 1830 Indian Removal Act. And so you had nations and communities like the Choctaw and others who were moved to quote unquote Indian territory, which was in the modern state of Oklahoma. 4,000 people died on that Trail of Tears walk of disease and starvation. It was a mass eviction. And I think about how the Choctaw had to abandon their homes and their schools, and they had shops throughout the Mississippi area to go on this terrible journey. And everyone did not go peacefully, of course, but sooner or later they all did have to go. Now, quote a chief dragging canoe who talks about this history, and he said that whole Indian nations have melted away like snowballs in the sun before the white man's advance. They leave scarcely a name of our people except those wrongly recorded by their destroyers. We had hoped that the white men would not be willing to travel beyond the mountains. Now that hope is gone. Finally, the whole country will be demanded. And the remnant of the real people, once so great and formidable, will be compelled to seek refuge in some distant wilderness. So there's a lot of losses, a theme running through this history. And then we move out to you all's neck of the woods to the west. And then you get to the myth of the American frontier, where many people still portray the story through the 17th through the 19th century as this time of opportunity for self-reliant colonists and frontiersmen to tame the wilderness. The reality is endless wars waged against indigenous people and the rapid theft of some 1.5 billion acres of land. It's a crime against humanity. The usurpation of land, separation of families, relocation of whole nations. I think about the Plains Indians of North America, tribes and nations that stretching from what is now Texas all the way up through Canada. And many were equestrian tribes dependent upon the masses of bison that roamed the plains, blackening the whole landscape, and the animals supplied everything that they needed, from food to clothing and it was a significant animal in their spiritual ritual. But then what began as a thriving population of bison, some 30 million of them in the 1840s, was down to only a few hundred by the end of the 1800s. So the animal was hunted to near extinction. You have photos of men standing by these buffalo skulls or bison skulls, and they seem to be like 2 stories high. Tourists shot the bison from trains with Gatling guns. And then again, you add the vicious legacy of white supremacy. And I say that because there was a desire to exterminate the bison to solve what President Ulysses S. Grant said was the Indian problem. You had the highest generals and politicians all saying this. One wealthy hunter said, kill every buffalo you can, every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. So this is genocide. This is a policy of famine, a policy of mass starvation of an ethnic group. And then we get to your state, California. There's some tragic history there as well, because we see that the population of indigenous people in California declined in the 19th century from as many as 150,000 to 30,000 between 1848 and 1870. I know where I'm from, everybody learns about the California Gold Rush, but they don't learn about how white settlers rushed to target and massacre Native people, and then the government gave them their land. And then you had the California Act of the Protection of Indians that was passed in 1850, and it provided for the apprenticing of Native children to whites, and it also punished vagrant Natives by hiring them to the highest bidder at an auction. So this was just slavery by another name. And then we go to 1851, where Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act, creating the Indian reservation system. But then you had some groups like the Yahi of Tehama County, California, and they were rendered extinct, so they wouldn't make it to a reservation even. The whole nation does not exist anymore. And then you see this, these policies, right, put into place. The Dawes Act of 1887 privatized land on reservations and gave it out to individual tribal members, but they had this provision in there that said surplus land, right? Surplus land could be given to non-natives. So by 1934, 95% of land allotted that was supposed to be for specifically for Native people was under white ownership. And then again, passing to the present, recently, a lot of us saw the news stories of the boarding schools and how they found the mass graves of the children in 2021. And they're uncovering this history now, and there's investigations being launched to learn more and to reckon with this history, right? Memorialize those lost. So you have a history of hundreds of thousands of indigenous children taken from their parents to be re-educated, some as young as 5 years old, so that by 1926, nearly 83% of school-aged Native children attended boarding schools. This was the other side of genocide, cultural genocide, the systemic destruction of traditions and values and language. So you had these instances where these kids were not treated well. They were treated horribly. Some burned their schools to the ground, that it was so bad there. And it wasn't until 1978 that parents won the legal right to prevent this form of family separation under the Child Welfare Act. So you think about how recent this is, right? And how long of a shadow this history casts. But then you also have stories of Native excellence that I think that is the other side of this, because I think for me, I try to look at history and it deals on equal terms with hope and despair, right? So you had Native writers and poets and doctors and scientists and athletes and those who left their achievements and words and names for us to know. There was a Native American woman, a writer named Zitkala Sa, a Dakota woman, an activist who fought for Native independence. A literary titan, I would say. She had books like Native American Stories. She pushed for the international recognition of sovereign tribes. And we know that Native people weren't made citizens until 1924, so her fight was for the full recognition of Native rights and humanity. I think about Jim Thorpe, the legendary Native American athlete of the Sac and Fox Nation who represented the US in track and field in 1912 when he had his shoes stolen before competing. But instead of quitting, he got one shoe from a teammate and then he found another shoe in a garbage can and the shoes didn't fit. They were too big, so he had to wear extra socks. And then he still won the Olympics with mismatched oversized shoes on. So there are stories of inspiration that we can find as well. And, I look at the history, for instance, of the Navajo code talkers of World War II. They helped expedite the war's end because of their secret coded language. It couldn't be deciphered by the Japanese, and some say that helped to end the war. So I also think on the other side of that, when you get a whitewashing of history, you not only get a whitewashing of the atrocity of history and the tragedy of history, but then often a lot of the stories of Native excellence are downplayed as well. We don't hear about those. And then as we move more into the modern era, we often hear about the stories of Black power. We often hear about, how white power has been so destructive in history, but we don't hear about red power in the 1960s and 70s, otherwise known as the American Indian movement. It's really a forgotten part of the civil rights movement. And you had Native activists seeking to reclaim their pride through their culture and ceremonies and privileging their ancestors. And you had these occupations that went on, right? The Bureau of Indian Affairs was occupied, the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota as well, and they were trying to make their voices heard. But Alcatraz, occupied between 1969 and 1971, that's probably the most famous. It was a 19-month-long protest where 89 Native Americans occupied that island. And of course, you probably know this history. It used to be a prison. It was owned by the US government. So the activists, they found this treaty. It was called the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. And that said that some unused federal lands could be open to claims by certain Native Americans. And so this was the impetus for them occupying Alcatraz. And as part of their proclamation, they said, "We, the Native Americans, reclaim the land known as Alcatraz in the name of American Indians by right of discovery." And they went on to say, "We wish to be fair and honorable in our dealing with the Caucasian inhabitants of this land, and we will purchase said Alcatraz for $24 in glass beads and red cloth," a precedent set by the white man's purchase of a similar island 300 years ago. And they had this dripping with sarcasm. They said, "We know that $24 in trade goods for these 16 acres is more than was paid when that Manhattan Island was sold, but we know that land values have risen over the years." So a little sarcastic, of course, biting, but they were dead serious. They were proclaiming their right to the land, right? So in recent years, I think that a lot of us have been reawakened to the struggle of Native people, right? Standing Rock, protesting the 1,100-mile Dakota Access Pipeline. People are coming to understand Indigenous survival and resilience and adaptability and pride and how they are etching their way in modern life. But yet, on the flip side, 1 in 3 Native Americans live in poverty. It's a moral disgrace. Conditions on the reservation have been described by many as worse than some of the most extremely impoverished nations in the world. But I, again, shift between hope and despair because I think there is so much hope within the younger generation of Native Americans today, cutting against the grain of history and saying that they're not going to let oppression have the last word. So we've talked about a lot today. I've covered a lot today, from just so many themes, from conquest to religion to warfare to spirituality. I've tried to weave humanity into this story. I have tried to briefly touch on what it has meant to be Native and American, just through my extensive research and the things that I found and pulled out of history. And again, what it means to be human, but not human in a narrow sense, but what does it mean to be human and connected to the land in a greater spirit that transcends a narrow self-important. So I hope that I've been able to give you a snapshot and offer you a little bit more complex view of Native history, not flattened by myths. And even though we're talking about history, I want to leave you with a quote for the future. It is by Ponca Chief White Eagle. He said, "Go forward with courage. When you are in doubt, be still and wait. When doubt no longer exists for you, then go forward with courage. So long as mists envelop you, be still until the sunlight pours through and dispels the mists, as it surely will. Then act with courage." Thank you all so much. Appreciate you having me here. If anybody has any questions or anything, I'd be glad to stick around for that. Thank you so much, Brett. Appreciate you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Jermaine. That was absolutely insightful and enlightening and incredible. Everyone, if you haven't already done so, we're going to open it up for questions. Please be sure to look in the chat. I have put access to where you can follow and support Jermaine. In February of next year, 2023, his book, The Humanity Archive, is coming out. It is available for pre-order on Amazon. You can also go to his website, thehumanityarchive.com, or listen and follow his podcast at The Humanity Archive. You can also find him on social media under the same name. Please be sure to support Jermaine and all that he does. The research that he does is extensive. His podcast is incredible. So if you're looking for a new podcast, make sure that you download it, that you like, that you comment, that you share. And with that, I want to open it up for questions for the time we have remaining. Does anyone have a question for the Humanity Archive?
Hey,
Don't be shy.
Jermaine, this is Mick. That was great. I learned so much from you. I'm wondering if you have a recommendation for a book or two that really explains, I know you couldn't get it in one book, but the Native American experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. I don't know if you've read this book, Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. This is a very comprehensive history that kind of goes from the beginning to modern times. And there's also, if anybody has young like teens, there's also a teenage version of that book. So that's one that I always recommend. Just right off the bat, I always kind of keep it close to me. So I would definitely recommend that book as a starting point.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you, Mick. Anyone else have a question for the Humanity Archive? Don't be shy.
Question. How did you become so educated on Native American history?
Well, I mean, my journey started way back when I was a teenager. And it started with Black history, where I didn't see myself represented in history textbooks. So I just went in the free public library and read my way into it and read my way out of it. And once I learned my history, I started to get this broader view of humanity, right? And that made me explore the history of all people. And so I really cast a broad net when it comes to the study of history. And I've been particularly interested in Native American history because I have some Indigenous background myself as well. So that kind of took me down that path to Indigenous history, starting with Black history, and just this desire to find a connection between all people's history as well.
I have a question. Not sure if you're based in California or if this is something you may be aware of, but the propositions that were recently placed for Californians to vote on Indian American casinos, kind of what your take on that is. I think it voted no with the 67% to make sports betting or something along the lines illegal, or not legal because it already wasn't allowed. But if you have any insight on that or familiar with what I'm talking about.
I'm actually in Kentucky. So, I'm not too well versed in, the casino, what's happening with that. And I would love to be enlightened, honestly, on that. And that's something I want to kind of look into further. I know that there's a long history of Native American casinos, and on the one hand, there's been a resource for the Native American community, but I know that there's also a flip side of that as well. So I definitely want to kind of educate myself on that aspect of history and how that's playing out today as well. But we don't have that here. So, I'm sorry that I can't speak to that a little bit more.
That's all right. Yeah, likewise, that came up on the voting pamphlet, and realizing I don't know much about it. I mean, growing up in the West Coast of Nevada, familiar that they're on Indian tribes lands, but what that history is there too. So that'd be something to look into for sure. Thanks.
Absolutely. And that curiosity is what fuels it, right? I mean, to have a question and seek an answer. And that's what really propelled me on my history journey as well. And why I love history so much, because it encompasses everything that it means to be human, right? Whether we're talking about the history of a casino and the impact of that, or, we're talking about harder histories like genocide, or we're talking about, you could dig into sports history, economic history. You have all these different facets of history. For me, as a very curious person who has endless curiosity, there's always something to learn. So I'm definitely going to take note of that in terms of looking at, I'm sure there's some interesting stories, and studying the history of Native American casinos will give a lot more context to what's going on today, and with that proposition that you were telling me about.
Does anyone else have a question? Because if not, I want you to take a moment, because you have an online course that you just dropped called Beyond 1492, where you go into this history even deeper. Would you take a little bit of time talking to us about that?
Yeah, it's an online course that I've created. And really what I've tried to move into is how can I make this history more accessible, because the average cost of a college course is about $1,000, right? And I think, to put together a lot of free resources, or resources that are very much cheaper than that for the general public, is something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. So I have Beyond 1492 was my first course that I came out with. And then I also have another one I'll be coming out with for February, A Journey Through Black History. And I'm just trying to make these expansive courses where you can take them almost like a college course and just move through it. So there'll be a free version, and then there'll be one where you can kind of join in to a community and learn this history with me over, the foreseeable future. I'll be updating the courses regularly. So if you follow me at thehumanityarchive.com, or follow me at the Humanity Archive on my Instagram page. If you just search the Humanity Archive, everything will come up for me. And yeah, that's how you can engage with me, follow me, and keep up to date on these courses. I share a whole lot of untold history on my Instagram page. The podcast I'm coming out with, sharing these stories. So definitely look me up, and join my community. I build the Humanity Archive, a community of lifelong learners who explore the experiences of humanity to enrich our lives and transform the world. And we do that by using history as a foundation. So I hope that you all continue to follow me, and join me further as I continue to unearth these overlooked stories and share them with you all.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jermaine. Again, for the folks that are able, if you could just give a round of applause to our special guest speaker. This may be the first time, but this will not be the last. Very appreciative. Look in the chat again. I dropped the link to thehumanityarchive.com, the upcoming book, The Humanity Archive, coming out in February of 2023. And you can follow the podcast, The Humanity Archive, and follow Jermaine on Instagram at The Humanity Archive. Please be sure to click on the post survey link. We want your feedback. We want to know if this was impactful. He wants to know what you thought about today's presentation. I appreciate and honor each and every one of you for coming. I'll stay on a little late just in case you have any more questions, but thank you all so much. The Humanity Archive, Jermaine, thank you for your time and your scholarship. We very much appreciate you all, and I hope that everybody has a fantastic week.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks,
Thank
Jermaine.
you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Red.
Bye. Later.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm ready
Later.
to go.
You're ready to go. That's right. That's right. See you later. See you later. See you later. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for joining. Bye. See you later. Thomas, Celeste, do you have a question for me? Is it Imole? Thank you for joining us too. Okay.